When immense pressure builds against a rigid structure, the collapse doesn't begin with a sudden explosion. It begins with microscopic surface cracks, stress fractures indicating the system can no longer bear the load. When Elon Musk stated that civil war is inevitable in the United Kingdom due to mass migration, he was pointing to those stress fractures. The response from the political establishment and traditional media was immediate and unified. Journalists and politicians dismissed the claim as far-right fiction, pointing to crime statistics and integration records to prove that society is functioning normally. I'm Legend, and to understand this divide, we have to look past the political rhetoric. Both sides of this debate are looking at the exact same country, but they are measuring two completely different things. The officials are not lying about the macro data, but they are using accurate spreadsheets to shield themselves from a severe systemic paralysis operating within the legal machinery itself. If you want to understand the mechanics of state collapse before it hits the headlines, hit the like button and subscribe. Trusting only high-level official statistics blinds the public. It creates a false sense of security, while the structural capacity of the state silently gives way. The political establishment's primary defense mechanism against populist claims is raw statistical arithmetic. To see this in action, we look at the baseline metrics from the Migration Observatory regarding the population in England and Wales. This chart compares the non-citizen population, 13.5%, against their share of convictions at 13.1%. Adding the prison population reveals 12.1%, slightly lower than the baseline. Tracking violent crime over time, the trend line sits flat at 0, confirming zero measurable impact. Researchers note only fractional, localized variations in property crime, a 1% increase here, a fraction of a percent decrease there, depending on the specific migrant demographic arriving. This math is exactly why media figures can confidently challenge Musk. When you view the nation purely through the lens of aggregate data, the hypothesis of a civilization in terminal decline collapses. Macro statistics successfully disprove the narrative of an imported street-level crime wave, but a spreadsheet measuring convictions completely fails to measure institutional impotence. The public is not reading academic studies. They are watching the visible collapse of state enforcement in real time. Consider the specific legal crisis surrounding the deportation of Albanian nationals from the UK, which recently culminated in a major upper tribunal ruling. Last year, the UK deported over 2,200 Albanians, accounting for a quarter of all enforced returns. Yet the system is actively choked by overlapping human rights frameworks. This flowchart maps the bottleneck. A convicted foreign offender moving toward a deportation order is blocked by the Human Rights Tribunal. He claimed he was trafficked prior, triggering a secondary barrier of modern slavery protections. Because returning the individual posed a risk of re-trafficking, the state remains legally barred from executing a deportation. This creates an unbreakable loop, where foreign offenders are permanently absorbed back into the system. A single blocked deportation does not skew the national crime statistics we reviewed earlier, but when the public witnesses a convicted offender permanently absorbed into the country despite a deportation, the macro data completely loses its persuasive power. These instances of state impotence, not a generalized crime wave, provide fuel for this civil war narrative. The UK government's official response to this growing loss of control highlights the exact disconnect between politicians and the public. Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood recently introduced what the government calls the most sweeping asylum reforms in modern times, detailed in their latest policy paper. The reality of these reforms is purely bureaucratic. The government plans to reduce initial refugee permission to 30-month increments and impose a visa break on nations that refuse to take back their citizens. While lawmakers adjust paperwork, the physical reality on the coast involves tens of thousands arriving in small boats across the English Channel. In stark contrast to the government's administrative tweaks, populist parties like Reform UK have proposed kinetic solutions, branding their policy Operation Fortress. Nigel Farage's proposal demands deploying the Royal Navy to physically intercept migrant vessels, offboard the passengers, and escort them directly back to French beaches. International lawyers immediately pointed out the gridlock of this kinetic approach. Returning individuals without permission violates non-refoulement laws and guarantees an immediate diplomatic crisis with France. The perceptual schism is clear. The public sees a physical invasion requiring physical deterrence. Officials see a logistical problem requiring administrative friction. The fear of a kinetic border collapse exists outside Britain. Spain recently provided a blueprint for how a border system fails under sudden pressure. The enclave of Ceuta, sitting on the coast of North Africa, serves as a real-world case study of system overload. In days, 60,000 migrants attempted to surge into a city with a population of only 80,000. The sheer arithmetic rendered Spanish border infrastructure entirely useless. This surge was not organic. Spanish authorities detected that Moroccan border guards, who typically police the African side of the fence, had suddenly vanished. This was a coordinated geopolitical maneuver. Morocco actively weaponized human migration, opening the floodgates to exert intense diplomatic pressure on Madrid. The fallout echoed across the continent. Italy's Giorgia Meloni pointed to the crisis as proof that open-door legalization schemes invite demographic weaponization from hostile neighbors. Ceuta demonstrates that borders depend on more than physical barriers. They rely on the constant, active cooperation of the state on the other side. When that cooperation is withdrawn, the system evaporates. When an external force can overwhelm a border using sheer, coordinated numbers, the state loses its monopoly on physical control. The fear of civil unrest becomes a highly rational response to systemic vulnerability. The friction in this debate exists because two different truths are being measured at once. Officials are factually correct that migration doesn't skew overall crime statistics. At the same time, the legal machinery responsible for removals has entered a state of visible paralysis. I'm Legend, and this brings us to the final verdict on the state of the West. When commentators warn of a coming civil war, they are not necessarily predicting neighbors taking up arms against neighbors in the streets. This balancing scale illustrates a crisis of legitimacy. Public trust collapses when a state cannot enforce borders or deport offenders, trapped in legal paradoxes. This friction is the inevitable result of a 20th century system failing to adapt to 21st century weaponized migration. Does the raw data tell the real story, or does the public perception of state failure reflect the actual truth? Let me know your read on the situation in the comments. National stability relies on a political class that acknowledges the limits of its own administrative tools. Denying the fractures in the machinery doesn't fix the pressure. It only ensures the eventual break is more violent.